Have you ever wondered whether to use loops or recursion in JavaScript? Well, we are going to take a look at that question today. So, many of you might not even know what recursion is. So let's have a look. What is it? It is when we're taking a function, for example, do something, and we're calling it inside of itself. So we're calling it recursively, like over here. This means that it's going to be called until there's a Stack Overflow error. So, thousands of times. Now this isn't really useful. But what is useful is when we add an if statement, like over here. Have a look at this code. We've got this 0, and we're passing it in as a parameter, I. And as long as I is smaller than 10, we are calling do something again. And this time, we're calling it with, the argument, we're adding 1 to I. In other words, this function do something is going to be called exactly 10 times. Because once I is 10, we're not going to call it anymore. Now, you might be thinking that's very similar to loops, and you're right. But what is better? Let's find out. So in this case, as you can see, we've got this variable, num, 10,000. And what we want to have ultimately is the sum of each integer from 1 to num. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 until 10,000. So I'll create a variable, sum, and I'll set it equal to 0 to start with. Then I will initialize this loop, and this is going to count from 0 all the way up to num. And each time, it is going to add I to the sum. So our end result is going to be the sum of, each number from 1 to 10,000. A huge number, as you can see over here. Now let's try this with recursion. Not with loops, but with recursion. So as you can see over here, I've created this function. I've called it SumUp. And this function takes in two parameters, num and sum. Num being 10,000 in this case, and sum to start with is 0. We also had it above here. Now, ultimately, I want to return that huge number that we just had. And I'm going to determine what I want to return using a ternary operator. But before I want to tell you, I want to start at 10,000 and go all the way down to 1. So I'm doing it the other way around. Well, I've got this ternary operator. Is num bigger than 0? If it is, we want to call SumUp recursively, as you can see over here. Now, don't worry about the arguments yet, because I'm going to explain them to you later. Now, once we've called it, we're repeating everything. We're repeating the entire ternary operator. If it is not bigger than 0, we want to return sum, because then we're done. We've got the entire sum, everything's finished. Now, every time when we call SumUp again, we are subtracting 1 from num, because ultimately we want to go from 10,000 all the way down to 1. And every time we're also adding sum to num, because we want to have the sum. We want to add, right? Now, pause the video if you need to, and look at this function again. Try to understand it. Down here we're calling it with num and 0, num being 10,000 obviously, and 0 being our starting sum, as you can see over here. If we call it, we get the same result as with the for loop. Perfect. Now, let's have a look at performance. Which one of them both is performing better? Let's start with the for loop. I'm going to be using console.time and console.timeend to figure out. Let's have a look at the console, and as you can see, it's about 0.9 milliseconds for the average. And if we do the same thing for the recursive function, and find out which one is faster. So as you can see, this time the average is about 0.2 milliseconds. So the recursive function is slower. Another thing to keep in mind when you're choosing is when we have bigger numbers, for example 100,000, we get a Stack Overflow error. And that is because the recursive function doesn't like it if it's being called too often. Now let's do the same thing with a for loop, and as you can see, it works. So this is another thing to keep in mind. So, which one is better? Let's look at the different pros and cons. Obviously, with loops, it is easier for beginners to learn, which is great, and it has also got a faster performance. Now, not that many things have to be that fast in JavaScript, but that is something to keep in mind. Also, it has not got a Stack Overflow error. With recursion, obviously, it has got no side effects because we don't change any variables. All the variables are constants, and this can be very good, especially if you come from functional programming. and if you like functional programming. With loops, obviously it has got side effects, and this can mean that it's not as easy to debug, because if you don't have any side effects, that means that it can be easier to debug, especially if it gets more complicated. And obviously, recursion has got a worse performance, and it can throw Stack Overflow errors. Now, don't think that these 2 points are that important, because I think most people can live with not having to have this recursive function, being called 100,000 times. But if you do have to have it, then loops is the clear winner here. Well, a place where recursion is very amazing is if you have something like this, a tree-like structure. Because there, using recursion, you can make code very, very short. Let's say you want to find out how large is this root directory, how many gigabytes. Then it is a lot easier to use recursion over here than using for loops, which would be, well, a nightmare. This was loops and recursion. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you the next time.